A man chooses, a slave obeys.
Welcome to the Ethics in Video Games podcast, where we explore issues at the intersection of ethics and video games.
What follows is a series of graphic, interactive scenes that we can't show you.
This is our second episode of Ethics News and Bits. It took, I think like 3 months or so since our last episode of Ethics News and Bits. So obviously,
that seems about right.
That seems about right, right?
Quarterly, yeah.
We're not on the cutting cusp of the news here, right? But every once in a while, we gather enough material to bring you smaller episodes that we really think, or let's say an episode that brings up smaller topics that we really think come from the news that are really worth talking about. Today we're going to talk about three things, and I think they're all super interesting. One is we're going to talk for a bit about China's new draconian, unprecedented, restriction for online gaming for kids. Which touches obviously on both kids and an excessive addiction and excessive play. We're going to talk about two games, the Doki Doki Literature Club and Boyfriend Dungeon, both of which recently have had issues over content warnings. And we're going to talk about what content warnings are about and what are the sort of issues we need to think about when it comes to content warnings. Mm-hmm. And then we'll get to cancel culture in gaming, and we're going to focus on specifically two cases. One has to do with Tripwire, and Tripwire who had a game called Tournament Fishing, and the other one is by, I believe, TGG Games.
The TGG game is the Tournament Fishing game.
Oh, that's the Tournament Fishing game, and then Tripwire.
And Tripwire just had a CEO who spoke out on Twitter.
Right. So the CEO, right? It's the CEO that got canceled, not the company. Well, right. Sort of. We'll talk about it.
We'll talk about it. We'll get everybody up to speed. Then we'll talk about the issues and the meaning behind all of it.
Yes. All right. So let's get to it. China. So here's what happens. I think it's a couple of weeks ago now, or a couple of weeks ago from the time we're recording. China essentially had already the most seriously restrictive policy in the world, right? So at the time, I believe it was that kids could play a maximum of 1.5 hours per day. And when I say kids, I mean minors.
Right. Under 18. 18
right.
or under, right?
Right. So, yeah, we're talking 17, 16-year-olds too, right? Maximum of 1.5 hour per day, and nothing between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. Right, so they had this kind of shutdown policy from then.
Right. And we should probably note that they can enforce this. I mean, people here in the U.S. would go like, how in the world could they possibly enforce it?
Right.
They enforce it because every person has an identity card, sort of an online identity that the government tracks.
Right. So in order to, in China and South Korea, both of whom have laws like this, to log in, you need essentially like a national ID that you log in with. Until this point, essentially, even though there has been this law, many kids, maybe most kids, were either using their parents' ID or grandparents' ID. So it was very common to go around this. However, the new law not only restricts, so now kids can only play video games Friday, Saturday, and Sunday night from 8 to 9 p.m., which I got to say, in my house, that's kind of family time.
Right.
Of all the time to pick, but that's the only kind of time, and holidays, I think, also in those hours, right? It's essentially part of the fight that China sees itself having to protect kids from video game addiction, what President Xi called spiritual opium. And, China, obviously, if you know anything about Chinese history, they particularly are worried about drugs, and, opium was a really, really big issue.
It was weaponized against them for 100 years.
Right, by the British.
By the West.
So in episode 14, we essentially talked about China and South Korea already. So that one is episode 14 is excessive gaming, a personal or social problem. And we talked about how countries like China and South Korea really kind of viewed this the situation of excessive gaming differently than most other countries. They see themselves as having a social responsibility to protect kids. And they're really thinking about how this is going to impact society. Still, at the same time that this happened, also very recently, South Korea abolished its shutdown law. So South Korea also had a law that banned kids from 16 from playing from midnight to 6 a.m. So the whole idea to make sure that kids got some sleep, at least 6 hours. And as as someone, when I was a teenager, I would wake up in the middle of the night to play and go to school tired. Right? I get that.
Right.
Okay, so at the same time that this happened, they also essentially, even before that, allowed parents to opt out, right? So the idea was this is going to protect people, but if you're a parent, right, you should have the option to opt out. And parents actually had to fight for this.
So,
right?
so they could opt out from the restriction and allow their kids to play whenever they wanted.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So that's the idea. Because part of this, and part of this issue is, does this policy violate the rights of parents, right, to raise their kids the way they want to raise their kids?
Right.
Right. Because
is that a right?
Well, it is to a degree, right?
I think people certainly would believe it here in the U.S.
Well,
but I can imagine a culture where that's not necessarily believed to be a right.
Yeah, it's a good question, right? I mean, in traditional societies, right, your kids were your property. You could do whatever you want with your kids, right? You could sell your kids, right? We have, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights has some children's rights in there, right? But we still kind of try to balance, right, the rights of parents to decide how to raise their kids, what to teach their kids, what to feed their kids, with our concerns about the general welfare of the kids, right? So we kind of try to create the situation where we look for the things that are beyond the pale that we just, child services is going to come take your kid away if you're not providing a kind of basic healthy environment.
Right.
But then we kind of
education.
And education, right? And then we kind of leave things up to you. And to some degree or another, I think this is the case in most countries. But certainly there are questions about at what point is the government too intrusive in terms of, in this case, the government telling you that how much screen time your kids could have, or how much game time your kids could have.
So they can no longer opt out, or parents can still opt out of this.
So in South Korea, parents can.
Okay,
right?
I got it.
So,
but in China, not so much.
But in China, not so much, right? So, and that part of it is really interesting, right? There's also kind of, and I'm kind of curious what you think about that, Andy. In terms of, would you consider this a violation of parental right to decide how their kids spend their time, or do you think this is something worth protecting enough for a government to do?
So I'm probably an outlier on this. On one hand, I don't have children, and on the other hand, I know people who should not be parents.
Right.
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 And so on one, I'm all for freedom and freedoms, but I do think that there is a very good argument to say the government should be doing more to help parents parent their children in a way that is useful and good for society. Now, helping them do it versus enforcing rules and restrictions, that's sort of the gray area in between, right?
Right.
But we here in the West, we hardly do anything, right? We insist that they go to school once they're of an age to go to school. But we don't even really, that's not really even a hard restrictions either, right? Because we allow people to opt out and homeschool their kids.
Right. Though we keep tabs on that, right? As much as
Right.
as much as
But
that's done.
we don't have any we don't When somebody becomes pregnant, we don't send them to parenting classes.
Right, and there are no, which is, by the way, really interesting, right? In terms of, I wasn't really thinking about pregnancy exactly, but I was thinking about other things like obesity, right? Like we don't like, go into, we don't tell parents you got to feed your kids in this kind of healthy way, right? Even though, childhood obesity is a very real thing. It's a very big thing. It's a very important thing. It's a far bigger problem, at least here to my mind, than, video game addiction, which is also a real problem, right?
Yeah.
Which is a real problem, but a much kind of smaller problem.
Yeah. I'm unconvinced about the real problem of video game addiction.
Okay, and I'm definitely convinced that some people, excessively play to a point where it definitely counts as addictive behavior.
Yeah. Oh no, I agree with that, but I don't know that the video games themselves are the addictive thing.
Okay, right, and we talked about that when we talked about addiction, right? About whether the video games are kind of just the outlet for whatever else might be underlying that might be going on.
Right.
And notice this is going to be part of the question about whether China's policy is a socially responsible policy, right? Because if the whole idea is that you're going to take a more active role in in children's lives to make sure that their lives are better, is this really doing that? Right now, I want to point. There's the South Korean cultural minister. As the shutdown law in South Korea got essentially stopped, essentially said, for youth, games are an important leisure activity and communication channel. I hope that preventative measures can respect the rights of the youth and encourage healthy home education. Now, to me, that's just really interesting, right? This idea of that leisure activity and communication is part of the rights of kids.
Yeah. I love that. I love that.
Well, yeah, to me it's interesting. Do kids have a right to play video games?
Right. Or do they just have a right to leisure activity in whatever form they choose?
Sure, right? I mean, they have a right. Well, I mean, again, I'm not sure what to say about the parent that insists that their children, study all day or do chores after school.
Right.
I don't think
go to work.
Right, or get a job. I don't know if the government should have any say in any of that. It's nice when kids have time to leisure, and the idea of kids being able to communicate with each other.
Yeah, that's very interesting too. The right for kids to be able to communicate with each other, with any other kids that they want. Can parents restrict who their kids?
Or at least,
I mean, it's usually a good idea.
The idea of a parent restricting communication, period, seems to me to be the kind of thing that stunts growth. We need socialization, right?
Right, but at the same time, if you see your kid starting to fall in with the wrong crowd,
right,
you will take measures to try to restrict your kids' ability to communicate and ability to hang out with the wrong crowd, right? And you should. Nobody knows your kid better than you.
Right. So if there is a right to communicate, right, it's kind of a general right. It's not like specific to every single person you want to communicate with, right?
Right.
It's I could immediately
they need socialization is basically what they're talking about. Kids need socialization.
And obviously they get a lot of the socialization from video games, but they don't have to. And to me, kids don't have a right to video games, right? That's just to me that's beyond but the pale. But okay, so is this a more socially responsible policy for them to do this? So part of the question is, I think, starting with your concern about the idea of addiction, is this really the best way to deal with the problem of addiction, right? So notice, number one, it's assuming that availability, access, right, is what creates the addiction. And it's possible, as you said, that there's...
not necessarily creates it, but certainly enables it, right?
Okay, enables it, right?
Yeah.
So right,
Like having access to the thing, and it's always at your fingertips, because literally it's at my fingertips. I've got my phone in my hand all the time.
Right.
So unless somebody's saying don't touch that all the
Right.
time, I could just touch it all the time, right? I could just, this is the thing I could do all the time. I could just keep.
And if that thing keeps having incentives for you to touch it, right? Now we're talking about potentially excessive use, right? And I mean, right, and in the same way, right, you can't become a heroin addict if there's no heroin available, for you to do it, right?
Right, exactly.
Regardless of the reasons that might drive you to become an addict, right? So, I mean, it's not that, you might not be targeting let's say the core reasons of why someone might end up engaging in addictive behavior, but maybe you are slowing it down or stopping it in some way.
Right. And there's some good science behind brain development and kids' brain development. Their kids' brain development continues until they're 25.
Right. And
so, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the things that you do as a kid really do affect you for a very long time. So if we can stop an addictive behavior from happening at that age, then maybe we could stop it forever.
Right, because addictive behavior can transfer to other forms of addictive behavior. Right,
it often does.
Right. So, you quit drinking and start smoking, right, at the same time, right? But the other issue kind of with this is that's kind of all they're doing, right? So we talked about how South Korea deals with this, right? They've got this huge apparatus of education, of counselors, of everybody being kind of alert for signs of excessive gaming, where they're looking to kind of help, right?
Right.
And to me, it's a more expensive way of doing it than just saying you can't do it.
Right.
It's obviously much more nuanced. I have no idea how much more expensive it is.
And it's less authoritarian for sure.
It's certainly less authoritarian.
And their laws may not even allow them to be as restrictive as China.
Yeah, that's interesting. I really don't know. Again, right, part of it is going to be what's the right of the parents, or do kids have these kind of right?
Yeah.
And
that is really super interesting.
Right. And then you kind of think of so when I originally heard that China was doing this, I was thinking, wow, what an interesting social experiment. Like, the rest of the world is going to grow up on video games. Kids everywhere are going to spend half their leisure time more playing video games. Everybody else is going to grow on video games. Chinese kids are going to grow up with very little video games, which mean they'll have to. And then was kind of this wild card. Means what's going to happen. And the more I thought, and my immediate thing jumped to all the things that I love doing when, I was young and, and there wasn't as many video games and the video games weren't as good.
They're going to have basically childhoods like ours where video games were not ubiquitous. They were special occasions.
Right.
They were, hey, let's go have Straw Hat Pizza, and Straw Hat Pizza had an arcade.
Sure. Right. Especially the going to the arcade part. Right.
Yeah.
Even though even with home consoles, right? It still it didn't feel when I was a kid, as in especially because you didn't have the online games, but. Then I thought of the downside. So part of me is like, oh my God, they're going to be reading and exploring. And and then I thought, wait a minute, what the hell am I thinking? First of all, my son has been watching YouTube. He hasn't had a game that he's been interested in a little bit. So instead, he's been Harry Potter fanatic, and he just watches YouTube videos, stupid YouTube videos of Harry Potter. And recently, I was like, I got to get him into a game.
Because games are a step up from just watching things passively, right?
Hell yeah, because there's so many good, smart games. He's playing Craftopia now on the Xbox, which is great, and it's so much better. It's so much better for him than than playing than watching these passive videos. So part of me is like, okay, are people just going to watch more TV, right? So that's one.
Right.
the other part is, you know, the only games that are getting restricted are the online games.
Right. So they can play single player games all day.
All day. And the online
which is,
games,
again, what we did as kids.
right, what you could do as kids, or you could have friends over and play together, though that's harder in places where people, you know, in Asia, people game outside of the home, but who knows, maybe you could do that, have someone come game with you at home, though there's not that many consoles in China, right, because they don't really use it. But, you know, the reason for it is because the online games have more of the mechanics that leads to addiction, right? And that makes sense. Yeah. But if I was a Chinese game designer, I might start putting those mechanics in solo games, right, as much as I could now, right?
Right. I mean, there's no reason that those mechanics can't go in solo games.
Right. And the biggest difference between online games and solo games is in online games, you're playing with other people. In solo games, you're now alone and you got no socialization.
Right. And so you don't have somebody going, "Whoa, wait, how did you get that?" Or on the other hand, somebody going, "Wow, that's super cool. How did you get that?"
Right.
To reinforce whatever crazy thing that you've done because you've been playing for 24 hours straight.
That too, right?
Right.
But you're not coordinating with your friends, right? You're not going on missions. You're not playing with your friends. You're playing alone, and that is sad. And I almost entirely play alone, but but that's kind of a personal choice, and that's because my life is too busy, and I don't want to coordinate with other people.
Right.
For the most part, but to me,
my wife and I do the parallel play where we sit together in a room and play the same game, but on our own.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. Right.
Okay. Yeah, I get that. Right. But this idea of going back to that and taking out the socialization of games, I worry that's going to be very harmful. Yeah. And then I think of the last. So I got one more concern here. It's easy to think of all the good stuff that we did when we were kids, when games weren't as pervasive, but it's easy to forget all the bad stuff.
Oh yeah.
All right. I mean, there's nothing to do, especially if you're like in small towns.
My friends and I would go out in the woods and hit each other with sticks. I mean,
literally.
Right. We
Right.
painted them bright colors, and we pretended they were lightsabers, and we basically went out in the woods and hit each other with sticks.
Awesome. That doesn't sound that bad. Was that right? These days they won't do it, right? But right? Notice, right? Young people have a lot less sex now than they used to, because there's just so much more to do, right? People used to have sex because there wasn't a lot of options of what to do, right? So drinking, etc., right? In some ways, it kind of reminded me, oh yeah, video games can be an actual, even if you're playing not games that are beneficial in any way. And, in our last episode, or the episode we have out now, right, is with Kat Schreier about how games can make you better. Even if we're not that elevated, right?
That's right.
At least they can make you better than like drinking in the parking lot, right?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So interestingly, when I heard about this, I thought, oh, that's an interesting way for China to restrict the cultural influence of the West. But then you pointed out that a lot of the games that they're playing are Chinese games.
Yeah,
so
the great majority.
Yeah, it's probably not even that but I do know that the industry has spent a lot of time and effort cultivating an audience in China, because China is this huge potential audience, right? And so the Western media companies look at it as a huge growth market.
Which is,
but now not so much.
Right. Now that's gone. So this is, I guess, the last part, right? Because game companies, this really seems to screw over game companies in a big way, especially non-Chinese game companies, which is interesting because notice, if you're talking about keeping up Western culture, maybe this could be a protectionist move to some degree for the Chinese game industry, because Chinese game companies are essentially, they're the ones held responsible. So remember how I said about how Chinese players get their parents' or grandparents' IDs, right? that's not going to be possible anymore because essentially companies like Tencent are essentially going to use stronger verification, like facial recognition software, right, to make sure that they do that. If a company like Electronic Arts does that, the backlash from the West is going to be way too big. I can't see them going into China and doing something like that. But maybe I'm wrong here.
We're using facial recognition software to verify a user?
To verify user information to restrict kids. I mean, what do you think? Would they do that?
I've heard of Western companies thinking about doing this just to make sure, just to confirm identities.
Just to confirm identities in general.
To prevent cheating.
Interesting. Outside of tournaments, just in regular games?
Yeah. Well, I mean, regular games and tournaments are quickly going to merge together in some ways. So yeah, anytime that there are stakes when you're playing an online game with other players,
anytime
they're going to make
stakes.
Sure that it's you playing the game.
I see. So I can't have, let's say, a good player play for me and get me to a higher level so I could compete.
Right.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Because I remember Maddie was talking to us about that in our episode on esports.
Yeah. So it may happen here in the West. It'll be interesting to see if it does.
Yeah, it's going to have to pass a lot of social hurdles here first for acceptance.
Right.
Okay.
It'll happen. I mean, games will be the way to do it.
Right. If it starts in anything, it'll start there. And obviously, your phone is the obvious place to do it. And this is where
because we've already started doing that, right? Your phone.
Sure.
My iPhone will look at my face as I'm putting in my code, or
Right. So and you could, I'm assuming you could do that for for microtransactions. You could authorize them with your facial recognition software.
Right.
So the interesting thing is doing for PC gaming, right?
Yeah.
When it goes there. Okay. So that's China.
All right. Moving on to the topic number 2.
All right. Now for our second topic. So essentially, there's been 2 controversies here. One has to do with this game called Boyfriend Dungeon. And Boyfriend Dungeon is this I think it's a really interesting game. It was released in mid-August. So right now we're in kind of like late September, so about a month ago. And it was originally kickstarted back in 2018 as this kind of inclusive queer romance game. And that part I think really matters. Like I played a gender non-binary, person with a they pronoun, right? So the idea that it was inclusive, that would let players engage in all different types of relationships. Its trailers essentially show it to be like this dungeon crawler. So it's a combination of this dungeon crawler where you go through different levels in this dungeon, and you do what you do in dungeon crawlers. You kill monsters and get treasures, and but at the same time you do it with weapons that are also romantic partners.
Right.
So you're dating
it's
your
such
sword.
A cool idea. It's one of these ideas that I really wish I'd had. It's so out there. It's so completely off the wall, but that it's amazing.
I thought it was a very cute, premise, right? It worked out pretty well, and so that was the idea, right? And to me, that's exactly how it seemed. It seemed like a light combination of these things. I've never played a game where you date people, and that part was fun. But the dating part of the story, so the dungeon part is simple, right? The dating part of the story gets into issues around personal boundaries. In that, so it has this antagonist, Eric, that makes these unwanted advances towards your character. I think you go on like one date with them, and it doesn't really work out, and it turns out that they're kind of prejudiced against people who turn into swords, which you're right, is they're racist in the game, right? And they end up stalking your character to some degree, and they try to emotionally manipulate you. To me, all that stuff was fairly light. But here's essentially what they did. So for this reason, the game added a content warning. And I think the content warning is really interesting, right? Because we have this ESRB ratings for games,
Yep.
and the ESRBs can also have their own kind of additional information that they give you, like that the game has, like if a game has rape in it, right? And I'm a rape victim, I want to know that, right? And I can, and hopefully it'll say sexual assault is in the ESRB label, right? Might be a part of it,
Right.
right? But then you have things that are not part of the ESRB labels. And there's always kind of questions with the ESRB, which, if anybody doesn't know, is the rating system for video games. It's just like the film rating system. It's a voluntary system run by the industry, where they essentially give these ratings. And
it's an independent body. You have to you don't have to, but big publishers all do. Is submit their games to it to get a rating, an official rating label that they can put on their on the box or on the ads.
And it's very strange to see a game that doesn't have an ESRB rating, at least a big game.
That's right.
Right.
That's right. All the publishers do it. It's industry wide.
Right. Now, there's always questions about what to add in terms of industry, in terms of ESRB warnings. And ESRB itself has, like, on its website a lot more information about things that could potentially be on there. I remember there was a movement to add, like, a label for sexist content.
Right.
Whatever exactly that would be.
Right. It also should be noted that the ESRB is not without its own criticisms. That a lot, especially on the developer side, you don't get a lot of information back from the ESRB about the grade that they've given it. They've given your game.
Right.
And they don't allow a lot of transparency to their process because they don't want anybody gaming it. And I understand that, but it can be, anytime a process is non-transparent, there are moments where you're like, wait, how did that happen?
Oh yeah, that's super frustrating. At the same time, I don't want people gaming it.
Right, exactly.
And it's it's too hard to evaluate who's right here because we don't know what the process is really like.
Right. Exactly.
But still, whatever the ESRB rating is, at least there's some games that seem to go beyond it, right? So in this case, they had this content warning, and they said this game may include references to unwanted advances, right? Because it's a dating game, so they're going to say, what about unwanted advances, stalking, and other forms of emotional manipulation? Play with care. Okay? So, they essentially went ahead and were aware that some people would have essentially, so this is their trigger warning, that some people who potentially have been stalked, right? They're stalking this game. This might traumatize them. If they've been emotionally manipulated, this might traumatize them. They gave them this content warning.
Right. And I love this, by the way. Everything about this I love.
Okay. Right. So this is a progressive game, right? But because the game was marketed with such a light tone, because it's a light game, right? So, it's not like it's still like a fun, light data game. It's just inclusive, right? But because it was marketed with a light tone, some people read that and thought that these topics might be like background details or avoidable some way, right? Because it said this game may include references to unwanted advances, stalking. So essentially they were like, well, maybe you can avoid this because maybe not, right? Maybe these are background details. And they complained about this, and strictly speaking, they're right? Essentially, it says may, but really, the stalking and this character is like super essential to the plot.
So there's no way to play this game without coming into contact with this character, and this character is always going to stalk you. He's always going to be emotionally manipulative.
Right. And he's kind of the tension in the game. Without him, the game is very, very. The narrative is not very interesting. You're just meeting you're meeting people. You're going on dates with them, and you're going to the dungeon.
Perhaps the may part of it is maybe some people would not even recognize that as being what he does as being emotionally manipulative.
Yeah, it's interesting what emotionally manipulative means, right?
Right.
And how serious that that is. Uh, you know, uh, it's also the idea of what might be emotionally manipulative to a teenager might not be emotionally manipulative to an adult because we would just laugh at that kind of attempt.
Mm-hmm.
So to me,
Right.
it didn't seem particularly emotionally manipulative in any kind of way that wasn't incredibly obvious.
Right.
In other words, I couldn't imagine the player being manipulated.
Right.
Right.
I mean, when we do violence, we can say, this is cartoonish violence,
Right.
right? But nobody has ever talked about cartoonishly manipulative,
Right, because
cartoonish emotional violence.
right, because obviously, partly because cartoonish is visual, right?
Right.
But this idea of uh, over the top and obvious emotional manipulation, I would say again, but
Mm-hmm.
maybe not if you're a teenager. Again,
Right.
maybe that's just because I read it as someone who has a long history of dating and can see right through that. So here's essentially what they did. So victims of trauma involving stalking, essentially, they say that like making things like stalking a central part of the game really makes it harder for them to engage with the game, right? And especially since they bought it, and this isn't a free to play. This is you pay $20 for it,
Right.
So they bought it without expecting that as part of the narrative, right?
Okay.
And part of the idea here is that because this was specifically like this queer romance game, and I think the team itself was was a very inclusive team and and had queer members. The audience itself also kind of knew that, and among the queer community, you have a lot more issues of emotional manipulation, of trauma with dating, and also things like like stalking. So your audience was more primed for that. Primed is not really the right word.
No, but you have an audience that is more susceptible.
So essentially, what the company did, right? The company that made it is essentially they ended up revising their content, listening to the players,
Great.
and saying, "Oh, okay, we didn't realize this," and revising their content warning.
Because again, that seems like the right thing to do.
But so they revised their content warning to the point where it's very explicit that the game is going to involve stalking and other things, and it says take a break if you need to. Like it's really handholdy, but at the same time, you're ruining the game. You're ruining the story for those of us who were could have had this as a surprise turn in the narrative.
Oh, I see.
Right. And this seems to be, the problem. I talked to my game design students today, and they were saying, well, look, I mean, if they got it on Steam, right? Steam has this 2-hour money back guarantee. They can buy it, try it, and if it seems that it has things that are obviously stalking and emotionally manipulative, they can bring it back. But of course, the stalking doesn't start right away.
Right, of course.
And of course, you can buy a game and not play it immediately. Though I think Steam, is it 2 hours of playtime?
I'm not entirely sure how that works, but it's something like that, yeah.
But, so, and is it fair to rely on Steam's money back guarantee to kind of solve this problem, or does the company need to solve this problem? And then there were some players that specifically that said, look, you need to remake this game. You need to consider that people could have trauma, and you need the entire storyline having to do with stalking an optional part of the game,
which would bring the game in line with their original content warning.
Yes,
it would be in that case. It would be it may contain stalking.
Right, if you want it to. Right, so that would be the idea. It's an option. Right?
Yeah, but it would be. How would you give the player the option?
You're the game designer. I mean, you can think of a way to make that happen.
not without doing the thing that you're already complaining about, which is giving away the story. Right,
Um,
right. Maybe there's a slider of like how much emotional abuse can I withstand, and I set that at the beginning. And it basically allows things to happen differently.
Again, right? And so they want to know up front. And this is part of the issue, right? They want to
Right.
know up front. There's other players that don't want to know up front.
Right.
What's
There's no way to make those two points of view meet in the middle, right?
right? So, and you have responsibilities to both of those, right? I mean, you have responsibilities, I think, to your players who might be harmed by something like this, at least to some degree.
Right.
And at least if it's not very hard, right, to make them aware of what's gonna happen. And again,
Right.
I
mean,
think
when you sell anything, you want to make sure that the audience knows what they're buying.
generally speaking, yes, but movies don't do this at all.
Some movies do, and some movies don't. Right. Some movies tell you pretty much exactly what you're going to get, and some movies really don't.
To me, it's pretty rare. But let me bring up the Doki Doki Literature Club, and let's talk about them together.
Okay.
'Cause the Doki Doki, I gotta say that's a pretty funny name. Doki Doki Literature Club. It's a Japanese game. So this is a really interesting game. So this also came out. I think this came out a couple of years ago, but then they came out with a new version in like June. So it looks like a cutesy dating sim. So it's another dating sim because it's interesting. These dating sims really kind of bring out some possibilities, right? So it looks like this cutesy dating sim. It's like this visual novel about a high school guy trying to get some girls, right? But it's actually underneath it a psychological horror game that breaks the fourth wall and addresses the player directly. And personally, just breaking the fourth, I get kudos to any games that break the fourth wall that do it well. I just think it's so cool. And it goes to some very dark places in some very dark ways, right? So it does. It has two of the girls that essentially you're going after. It separately end up committing suicide.
Rough.
One of which you need to. I think you watch, and then you're forced to watch as her body decays. There's self-harm. There's physical abuse in the game. And again, this is like a cutesy manga kind of like story, so you're not expecting that, right?
Well, certainly in the West you're not, but I know that manga is the manga as a style, and manga as a cartooning style is been used in Japan to tell all kinds of stories.
Okay, fair enough.
Japan might not be quite as shocking in Japan.
Maybe. But the complaints is that the marketing makes it seem very light. And if you look at the ad, it really seems very light. Now, but that said, the game originally had the warning, this game is not suitable for children or those who are easily disturbed. So this warning came on the first time you played the game.
Right.
So the first time you play the game, you have this warning, and that's it's really interesting that you have this super...
So there's a problem with that, right? Because if you're expecting it to be one thing, and then you get a warning label that says, hey, this might not be the thing, this that suggests, and doesn't even say, just suggests that it might, that the tone is going to be different than what you're expecting.
Right. You're
not going to heed that warning.
Or you can easily...
it'll be easily like how horrible could it be? Look at it.
Right.
And you'll just pass by it. You won't even remember it.
I also want to say that there's been plenty of games where the warning was on and I was in another room the first time it loaded. Like I went to get a drink or something.
Right. So you may not even see it. Right.
So you may not see it. There was a URL to a website that would give you a full list of content warnings if you wanted it. But, part of it is what's interesting about this game is the way it's playing with genre, right? Mm-hmm. The way it's subverting your expectations, right? So this is, again, I'm thinking if this was a movie, right? what would they do? The trailer for the movie would probably hint that there's a darker side, right? Because you would think that you wouldn't bring like kids to a move to it and then have it turn to be a horror movie, right?
Right.
But how much?
How many people went to see Brokeback Mountain thinking it's going to be a Western story about cowboys?
Right. Yeah, that's true. Though it's interesting the kind of things that you need content warnings about, right? Because again, right, if this is, let's say, something that is you're going to bring kids to, and then it's going to be super freaky for them. That seems very different than a movie that has a couple of gay guys kissing, right? Or do more than kissing. Right,
Yeah.
But which was very shocking to many people at the time, right?
Right.
But still, it would be an adult audience that went to that movie, and the movie was rated R if I remember correctly, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And it's interesting. I actually don't know what Doki Doki was rated, and
Right, and remember, if it's a Japanese game, it wouldn't have gone through the SRB.
Right. So
it's an American market.
Is that always the case? If they sell it in the American market, do they need to?
They don't need to, but there's a lot of places that just won't advertise it.
Okay.
Publishers really want to do it.
Right. So,
American publishers. So if it had an American publisher that picked it up from the Japanese and then there's a word I'm looking for.
Localized it.
Localized it, yeah.
Okay.
Localized it for the U.S.
Right.
Then they probably would have. But if it's like some people bringing over Japanese games, which a lot of people do that, it may not have any SRB rating.
Okay. Right. Because notice, right, if this is like a mature rating, right, then that's a warning, and the ESRB then is taking care of it.
And I don't know. Right? I don't know if Japan has a similar organization.
And I don't either. And they have very different cultural norms when it comes to a lot of this stuff.
Right.
Lots of fans considered essentially the game's horror deceptive, right? And the developer, which was Team Salvato, they also added the following option for players. So as a reaction to this, right? They say at the beginning, I think of every kind of game as an option. Would you like to review detailed content warnings which contain spoilers, as well as a setting that would warn the player in-game whenever they were about to experience potentially upsetting content?
So have you ever read Galapagos,
No.
Vonnegut novel?
Oh, I love me Kurt Vonnegut, but I don't know. I've read a lot of them. I don't know if I read that one.
So in Galapagos, the narrator is a character who's 10,000 years old and telling the story from 10,000 years in our future.
Okay.
The story is taking place in more or less our contemporary now, and the narrator at one point tells us that he understands that when characters die in a book, it can be quite shocking and quite traumatizing for the reader, and so what he's going to do as he narrates the story is from this point on, he's going to put an asterisk next to the name of anybody who's going to die in the next 24 hours in this story.
Okay. Okay.
And then you're like, oh, that's a funny little gag. And then the first time it shows up, it's like a fish that somebody's catching, and plans to eat. And so, haha, it's very funny, right? And then and then a little bit later, it's a character, and you're like, oh, what's happening? And then at one point in the book, everybody's name starts getting an asterisk.
Okay.
So he's not using it. He's using this idea. And remember, this book was written in the 80s, I think. So well before any of these content warning ideas became a thing.
But I'm assuming he's making fun with it because he's a funny guy.
Absolutely, he's a funny guy, and he's making fun of it. But he's also making a very pointed statement about
these kinds of warnings. It's interesting, this ability to have in the beginning of every. I'm assuming not just the first time you play the game, but as part of your menu, would you like to review detailed content warning which contains spoilers?
You can imagine like a little asterisk appearing, like in the corner of the screen, like, hey, some really dark stuff is about to happen.
Right. Well, but notice that would be like an option. Right. So, it's not like you're forcing everybody to go through that. You're saying, look, if this is something you care about, if this is something that you're worried about, I'm going to put it in part of the game settings that you can, get the content warning about everything that's going to happen. And that's going to, that might have a bunch of spoilers that might, make the story not as impactful, but maybe that's kind of the point for you because you don't want to be impacted negatively by it, while leaving other players to be able to enjoy the story. But this idea also of being able to have a setting, and by the way, okay, don't tell me anything, but let me know whenever something potentially upsetting. And it's interesting also what would count as potentially upsetting and how they would be with this.
And it could be used, in a way to like even add suspense.
Look, to me, there's like these, these kind of two questions here that are pulling against each other, right? Because, what is in these kind of situations where you got these kind of, I can see how things could trigger certain people, right?
Yeah,
In
people
real
have
ways.
Trauma. And what we're becoming aware of, and what we're becoming sort of alert to, is that people out there have trauma, and they've been traumatized by other things, and we don't want to re-traumatize them with that. We don't want to accidentally re-traumatize people because then they don't like our games, and we don't, and that's bad for us. We want people to like our games.
Sure, that's from the game designer perspective. From my perspective, from the ethicist perspective, is you don't want to cause harm, right? Though, if we're talking about a potential snowflakey situation where if it turns out that what people need are exposure to stuff like this to be able to handle it more.
I'm not going to tell somebody what they need. Are you going to tell people what they're going to need?
No, I'm talking about what the objective, if it turns out psychologically this is what, people in general need, then that is also part of the responsibility. Right, if you're harming, you could be harming someone both by putting something in and by taking something out. I think, but I'm certainly I would play it safe here, personally.
Right. But I feel like they did. I feel like they did the right thing every step along the way. Maybe not Doki Doki, but the other one, Boyfriend Dungeon. Yeah, Doki Doki, the game is not suitable for children or those who are easily disturbed. That seems like a reasonable thing to say, too. You can create a content warning that doesn't give away plot points, if that's important. But that has to be important to what you're doing and important thing for your audience. Right. If plot points aren't important, then give them all away. Sure, why not? So if it's more important to your audience to have these trigger warnings, then give them trigger warnings. If it's more important to your audience to not have trigger warnings, then I say, it's just a creative decision. Like it's an easy thing to do. It's not an easy thing to do, right? Making creative decisions is not an easy thing to do, but it's the only way you have to, right? I don't think, is there any other way?
Let me put it this way. In a sense, all of these decisions are creative decisions, right? Any decision we're going to make about the game is a creative decision, right? We want them to be, we can think about whether they're going to be made with the focus of the artist's desire of creating good story, or we can focus on whether they're going to focus on moral responsibilities or kindness or whatever we talked about, or how they're going to balance it. Right. And I think that's kind of the issue here, right? My initial response would be, I just want the artist to have their vision. But then I have this thought of, wait, but aren't there some responsibilities here? And then I want the whole kind of creative vision to kind of put those two things together and balance them in whatever way they think would hold on to their creative vision while trying to, as much as possible, while not undermining that too much, show kindness or responsibility.
I think the difference there is then one's creative vision should not be more important than your audience's experience. And so a good creator, somebody who's doing this well, in my opinion. So this is entirely a moral judgment on my part.
Okay.
Somebody who does this well, does this seamlessly. Somebody who does it poorly can make their vision a thing without caring what their audience thinks of it or how they're affected by it, or how the audience experience is, and feel like they have satisfied their artistic vision.
Right.
At the expense of their audience.
Yeah, I was,
and I feel like that's a failure.
Yeah. I get. I was
Right.
thinking of Celia Hoden, talking about how ethics is part of UX, right?
Right.
If you're thinking about the user experience, right, and you're not thinking about ethics, you're leaving something out.
Right.
Right.
So my creative vision
Right.
should be woven tightly to the experience that I want my players to have.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm advocating for.
All right. I'm with you then.
I thought you were.
All right, Andy. It definitely looks like we are not going to be putting
We're
this
not going to
third
get
part
to
in here.
We're
right?
not going to get to the third one. We'll have to come back and talk about.
We're going to do part 2.
All right.
Right.
We'll do it.
Or we might make this an entire thing on cancel culture. We'll see. But it'll be the next episode. Good podcast.
Good. GP.
GP. Play nice, everyone.